The Force. It is a phrase we know, a concept we grasp from 1,000 battles and 100 generations of stories. We see it as a light, a dark, a binary choice of cosmic morality, a weapon for heroes and a tool for villains. But this is not what it is. This is not what it was. Before the dogmas, before the wars, before the Jedi and the Sith, it was simply everything. A living, breathing energy field, a river of infinite mystery flowing through every cork of existence, connecting all things, binding the galaxy together in a web of sublime and silent energy. It was not good. It was not evil. It was simply existence itself, vast and terrifying, and beautiful and unknowable. And for eons, it was untouched by conscious design, a song sung without a listener, a symphony performed for an empty hall. But life, in its infinite curiosity, its desperate need to find meaning in the void, eventually learned to hear the music. This is the story of that first, tentative, trembling listen. A story not of heroes and villains, but of pioneers and pilgrims, of terrified and courageous souls who reached into the unknown and found something magnificent looking back. And it is the story of how that first, pure, unified understanding was fractured, shattered by fear and ambition, leading to a tragedy that would define the destiny of the galaxy, a wound that would bleed for 100,000 generations. Who were the first to touch the Force? What did they feel in that primal moment of connection? And what series of small, understandable choices led to such a catastrophic and permanent division? Our story begins not with a bang, but with a call, a silent, psychic vibration that echoed through the chaos of hyperspace, a frequency only a specific, rare consciousness could perceive. It originated from a world unlike any other, a planet deep in the unknown regions, a place of raw, untamed, and lethal power. Tython, not a planet found by its inhabitants, but one that actively called to them. Its very core was a hyperdense nexus of the Force, a storm of pure energy that made its surface both breathtakingly beautiful and instantly deadly to the uninitiated. The atmosphere itself was thick with unseen power, and to be untrained on its surface was to risk a psychic shock, madness, or a painful cellular disintegration. To this world came the answer to its call, the Tho Yor, great geometric pyramid, ships of utterly unknown origin, their builders and purpose lost to time. They did not conquer, they did not invade, they gathered, a silent, patient, and benevolent harvest. Across the galaxy, they sought out individuals, beings who felt a strange and isolating connection to the world around them. Those who could sense the emotional residue of a room, who had hunches that always proved right, who felt a deep, abiding peace in nature, or who were plagued by a terrifying, uncontrollable rage they could not explain. They were the outliers, the strange ones on their worlds, often misunderstood, feared, or shunned. They were drawn to the ships as a moth to a flame, a compulsion they could not deny, and the ships, acting as silent shepherds, brought them all home to Tython. Imagine that journey, not as a historical event, but as 1,000 personal, terrifying epiphanies. A Duros miner, working deep in the crystalline crust of a mineral-rich asteroid, who always knew exactly where the richest veins were, a feeling in his gut he dismissed as luck. He touches a strange, cold, black metal wall of a pyramid that had materialized in the cavern beside him, and is transported inside, joining a silent, awestruck congregation of figures from 100 different species. A Twi'lek artist on Riloth, who feels the entire history of an object when she holds it, the joy and pain of its previous owners flooding her senses in an overwhelming torrent that often left her bedridden for days. She follows a compulsion to walk into the trackless desert, where a silent, hovering pyramid waits, its entrance open like a mouth. They would arrive on Tython, a world that vibrated with an energy they could finally feel without filter. A deafening roar after a lifetime of whispers. Their first experiences with the Force would not have been as a weapon or a tool. They would have been accidental, terrifying, and sublime acts of unconscious creation. A child, scared and alone, separated from her family in this strange, roaring new world, wishing for comfort with all her heart. And suddenly the terrifying, six-legged predators circling her stop, their aggression soothed by a wave of calming. Energy they radiated without knowing, and they lie down peacefully around her. A farmer, feeling a deep, frustrated anger at the unyielding soil, clenching his fists, and a spontaneous storm cracking the purple sky above his fields, lightning striking the exact spot that frustrated him, shattering the rock into fertile gravel. They were feeling the living force, the energy of all things, and they were influencing it without any understanding of how or why. They were infants, tapping into the power of a star, unaware of the conflagration they could unleash. On Tython, they found others like themselves, and together they began to learn. They formed a community not based on race or origin, but on shared experience and shared survival. Their first studies were not philosophical, but practical. How to stop the storms of emotion within from triggering storms in the sky. How to build shelters that could withstand the planet's energetic tides. They studied the energy that pulsed through their new home, a collective project of survival that slowly evolved into a spiritual pursuit. The planet itself was their teacher, its harsh lessons written in lightning and earthquake. They came to understand its dual nature, not through doctrine, but through brutal, empirical observation. They gave it names. Ashla was the light side, the energy of life, of peace, of creation, of order, of community. It was the warmth of the sun, the growth of a forest, the calm of a still mind, the healing of a wound, the selfless act. It was the gentle, nurturing, building aspect of the cosmos. Bogan was the dark side, the energy of passion, of emotion, of chaos, of change, of destruction, and of death. It was the earthquake that reshapes the land, the wildfire that clears, the old growth for the new, the grief that follows loss, the anger that sparks action, the selfish desire. Crucially, they did not see Ashla as good and Bogan as evil. They saw them as necessary, complementary opposites, like dawn and dusk, like breath in and breath out, two sides of the same coin. To embrace one and reject the other was to become unbalanced, to become less than whole. And on a world as powerful as Tython, imbalance had immediate physical consequences. A person leaning too far into Bogan might find the very ground cracking beneath their feet, toxic plants growing at their touch. One too deep in detached Ashla meditation might be literally swept away by a sudden wind, too disconnected from their physical form to anchor themselves, or find life draining from the plants around them as they unconsciously absorbed its energy. Balance was not a spiritual ideal. It was a practical, daily necessity for survival. It was the key to living on Tython, and in their view, the key to living. This philosophy became their entire foundation. They called themselves the Jedi, a term from the ancient language of the planet, meaning mystic center. They built great temples, not as fortresses, but as instruments of learning designed to amplify and focus specific aspects of the Force. The Temple of Science in the Greater Sea focused on Ashla, a place of healing, calm, and biological study. Anchors, a temple sheathed in naturally growing sapphire, was a place of learning, history, and knowledge. The Temple of Vor Tepi, built atop an active volcano, was a place to safely confront and understand the raw, terrifying power of Bogan. They forged the first Force-imbued swords and daggers, weapons with blades of solid, stabilized energy, precursors to lightsabers, These were not primarily for combat, but as tools, lenses to help channel and focus their abilities, to cut through mental illusion and directly manipulate energy, or to perform precise surgical strikes on the environment. Theirs was a life of pilgrimage, the central defining tenet of their culture. This was the great journey. If a Jedi felt themselves leaning too far towards the passionate, emotional, impulsive Bogan, they would journey to a moon like Ashla, strong in the light side, to meditate, to serve, and to find their center. If they felt too detached, too coldly analytical, numb to the world and their own feelings, they would seek a dark side nexus like Bogan to understand the power of emotion, instinct, and passion. Their entire existence was a dance, a perpetual personal quest for balance within themselves and with their world. They were guardians of Tython, philosophers, scientists, and eternal students of the universe's greatest mystery. Their society was a testament to the idea that true strength lay not in choosing a side, but in mastering the tension between them. Their practices were explorations of consciousness itself. They developed early forms of telekinesis, not to move mountains, but to understand the tangible connection between thought and matter, to feel the weight and texture of an object with one's mind, to understand its place in the world. They practiced healing, seeing it as the ultimate expression of Ashla's nurturing energy, a conscious, selfless act of sharing one's own life force to mend another. But they also studied psychometry, the ability to sense memories from objects, an ability deeply tinged with the pain, joy, and raw emotion of Bogan, requiring immense emotional fortitude to experience without being overwhelmed. They understood that to truly know the Force, one had to know all of it, the beautiful and the terrible. Theirs was a golden age of understanding, a quiet, profound conversation with the universe itself. It was not a utopia, for they were still mortal beings, with desires, fears, and conflicts. But their entire culture was structured to guide them back to the center, back to balance, through ritual, practice, and community. It was a fragile peace, but it was peace nonetheless, built on a wisdom that would later be forgotten, a wisdom that understood the darkness, not as an external enemy to be destroyed, but as an internal part of the self to be acknowledged, respected, and integrated. This was the first and greatest truth of the Force, and it would be the first thing lost. But harmony is a fragile state, a delicate equilibrium constantly tested by the winds of ambition, fear, and intellectual pride. Over generations, as the Jedi settled into their traditions, a faction grew within their ranks. They were often the most brilliant scholars, the most powerful historians, the most gifted practitioners who looked at the Force and saw not a balance to be maintained, but a frontier to be conquered, a set of natural laws to be decoded and mastered. They were called the Ravens, and their symbol was a black bird, a creature of intelligence, foresight, and omen. They were intellectuals, but ambitious ones. They looked at the Bogan not as a dangerous, necessary force to be balanced, but as an untapped source of knowledge and power, an uncharted ocean they were being told merely to wade in. They argued in councils and in written treatises that true understanding required delving deeper into the dark side, that the Jedi's strict adherence to balance was a limitation, a fear of true potential. They suggested that the policy of exile to Ashla for those who fell to Bogan was a form of suppression, a way to stifle progress and maintain a comfortable, static status quo. This was not, at first, a movement of evil. It was an intellectual divergence, a different interpretation of the same text. They believed with genuine conviction that they were pursuing a more complete, more honest truth. They saw the restrictive, cautious practices of the Jedi as a cage built around infinite potential, and they longed to pick the lock. Inevitably, the philosophical tension bled into the practical world, fueled by the very energy they sought to command. The Orthodox Jedi, who became known as the Temple Masters, watched the Ravens with increasing concern and suspicion. They saw their experiments as reckless, their philosophies as a slippery slope that ignored the fundamental, seductive, and dangerous nature of the dark side. They witnessed Ravens using Force abilities not for harmony or understanding, but for demonstration, to prove a point of superiority and strength. The Ravens, in turn, began to see the traditionalists as cowards, too afraid to grasp the full potential of the power they wielded, content to play in the shallow end of an infinite ocean. The ideological conflict soon manifested in the physical world. Disagreements in the temples turned into heated arguments into dangerous, uncontrolled clashes of raw Force power. These were the first sparks of what would become Force combat. The first time a Force push was used not to clear debris, but to aggressively throw a rival against a wall to win a debate. The first time a mind trick was used not to calm a beast, but to enslave a rival's will and humiliate them. A Raven might use a lightning-like discharge of pure Bogan energy, not for illumination, but as a warning shot that scorched the earth at a rival's feet. The very energy of Tython began to ripple with their discord. The weather patterns grew more violent and unpredictable. The ground trembled with greater frequency, and a palpable psychic tension hung in the air, a pressure that weighed on every mind. The Force itself was sick with their conflict, the planet reacting to the severe imbalance growing in its children. The ruling council of the Jedi, the Assembly, watched this schism widen with dread and a growing sense of panic. The Ravens, now more organized and openly embracing the Bogan in their practices, were no longer just a philosophical movement. They were a clear and present danger to the stability of Tython itself. Their practices were causing tangible, planetary-scale instability. The Force storms that occasionally raged on the planet became constant, threatening the structural integrity of the great temples and the settlements around them. The native creatures, usually placid if respected, became aggressive and fearful. Fearing for the safety of their world and the complete collapse of their way of life, the Assembly made a fateful, tragic decision. The Ravens were to be exiled, not sent on a pilgrimage, but cast out entirely from the Tython system, their names struck from records, forced to flee on whatever ships they could muster into the vast, unforgiving emptiness of space. It was a moment of profound failure. It was not a victory for the light, but an admission of defeat for the ideal of balance. The Daii had chosen to sever a part of themselves rather than continue the struggle for integration. They had chosen purity over unity, exile over understanding, fear over compassion. In trying to preserve their peace, they created their own antithesis. And in doing so, they set a terrible new precedent for the next 30,000 years that those who disagree on the nature of the Force must be removed, not reasoned with. That difference is a disease to be quarantined, not a perspective to be understood. It was a betrayal of their core principle, and it would cost the galaxy everything. The exiles drifted, lost and bitter, a ragged fleet of the disillusioned and the betrayed. They had been rejected by their own family, cast out from their home, their sanctuary, for their pursuit of knowledge, for their ambition to see further. Their connection to the Ashla, the light, faded without the temples, the teachings, and the supportive community of Tython to sustain it. But their connection to the Bogan, fed by their anger, their pain, their profound sense of betrayal, and their thirst for vindication, grew stronger, becoming a cold, burning fire that kept them alive in the void. They were a people without a home, and their rage became their compass, their shared bitterness, their new cultural identity. They scanned the stars, not for knowledge or wonder, but for a place that reflected their inner state, a world that resonated with their pain, and they eventually found it. A world that was a festering wound in the Force, Korriban, a desolate, blood-red planet of deep canyons and ancient tombs, A grave world so strong in the dark side, it was a psychic scream in the void, a place of endless sorrow and anger. Energy did not just welcome them. It embraced them like a long-lost child. It fed their bitterness, amplified their darkest emotions, and whispered promises of absolute power to their broken spirits. It was a perfect, terrible mirror for their souls. On Korriban, the transformation completed, calcifying into a new, hardened, and cruel form. Cut off from the light, the former Jedi no longer sought balance. They actively rejected it as a Wung, lie of the weak, a fairy tale told by those who feared true power. They embraced the Bogan fully, diving into its depths without restraint or remorse. They saw its power not as one half of a whole, but as the whole itself. Why seek balance when you could have absolute dominance? Why seek understanding when you could have absolute control? The dark side offered them strength, clarity of purpose, and a means to assure they would never be victims again. They encountered the native Sith species, red-skinned, proud warriors who were naturally strong in the Force but primitive in technology. The exiles did not seek to live alongside them or learn from them. They conquered them, using their refined Force abilities as weapons of terror and domination, choking, electrocuting, and mentally shattering their opponents. They subjugated the Sith, becoming their ruling god kings. They interbred with them, and in a final act of appropriation, they took their name, becoming the Lords of the Sith. They built a brutal, hierarchical empire on a foundation of pain, power, and the rule of the strong. Their philosophy crystallized into a code that was the absolute inversion of everything Tython stood for. Peace is a lie. There is only passion. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength, I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. The Force shall free me. The first Dark Lords, like Ajunta Paul, were not born of pure, cartoonish evil. They were tragic figures, corrupted idealists. They were the children of a schism, who grew up in a desert of hatred and learned not just to survive there, but to rule it. They were the living proof of the Jedi's greatest fear, and in their hearts, they believed their former brethren were fools who had chosen weakness over glory, delusion over truth. They were what happened when the quest for knowledge was divorced from wisdom, and power was divorced from compassion. The original, beautiful, and sophisticated vision of the Force was now utterly lost, shattered into 1,000 pieces and ground into dust. The complex, nuanced idea of Ashla and Bogan in eternal, necessary, and respectful harmony was replaced by a simplified, polarized, and childish mythology of light versus dark, good versus evil. In its place stood two opposing, absolute, and rigid dogmas. The Jedi, reeling from the trauma of the conflict and the exile, began to fear the dark side utterly. They began to systematically purge its influence from their teachings, moving towards a philosophy that championed the light alone, that saw emotion not as a part of the whole self, but as a pathological path to darkness. They became more rigid, more dogmatic. Their practices focused on suppression of the self, rather than balance of the self. They would eventually become the Jedi Order, their name a shortening of their past, their philosophy a reaction to their trauma, a fortress built against the darkness they had helped create. And across the galaxy, their dark mirrors, the Sith, built their entire civilization on the foundation of the dark side alone. The Force was divided. The dance was over. The conversation had become a shouting match, and the argument would soon become a war of annihilation that would consume the stars. The stage was now set, the players defined, for a conflict that would burn for millennia, consuming countless worlds and lives, all because of a failure on Tython. A failure to hold complexity. A failure to love the difficult questions more than the easy answers. This is the true, profound, and deeply human tragedy of the Force's dawn. It is not a simple story of a pure light side being corrupted by an external, mustache-twirling dark side evil. It is a much more relatable, and therefore more devastating story. It is the story of a family that broke apart. It is the story of a beautiful, sophisticated philosophy of balance that could not withstand the pressures of ambition, fear, and intellectual pride. The first schism did not begin with a declaration of war or an act of obvious villainy. It began with a philosophical debate in a library. It began with a treatise. It began with a desire to know more, to push boundaries, to not be limited by tradition. It was a failure of communication, a failure of compassion, a failure to hold complexity, and ultimately, a catastrophic failure to live up to their own highest ideals. The exile was the point of no return, the moment a difference of opinion was cemented into a fundamental, irreconcilable rift through an act of rejection. It was the original sin of the Force-wielding orders, a trauma that would be repeated again and again, from the 100-year darkness to the Mandalorian excision, each time the Jedi casting out those who dared to think differently. The legacy of this schism is every battle between Jedi and Sith, every life lost, every planet scarred from the 100-year darkness to the Battle of Exile. It is the ultimate price of a lost ideal. Even in the later ages, haunting echoes of that original Jedi philosophy remained, like ghosts in the machine of galactic history. The Jedi Code's extreme warning against passion, a direct trauma response to the Ravens' fall. The concept of a chosen one who would bring balance to the Force, a lingering, ancient, half-remembered prophecy of what was once meant to be. The existence of beings like the Bendu, who claimed to be the one in the middle, who embodied that forgotten ideal of the center and found both the Jedi and Sith to be childish. The internal conflict of a Jedi like Luke Skywalker, who instinctively knew that cutting himself off from his attachments and emotions was not the true path, even if he couldn't articulate why, leading him to nearly repeat the mistake of the assembly with Ben Solo. The entire journey of Rey, who had to acknowledge the darkness within her lineage to find her true strength. These are all ghosts of Tython, whispers of the path not taken, a dream of balance that refused to die completely, a persistent melody beneath 25,000 years of dissonant war. The Force was never meant to be a weapon. It was meant to be a song, a complex, beautiful, dissonant, harmonious, and sometimes terrifying song of existence. And for a brief, shining moment on Tython, they all sang it together in all its parts. They understood that to be whole, one must acknowledge the light and the dark within, that the goal was not to eradicate the shadow, but to understand it, to integrate it, to find the mystic center where all things are in harmony. That the first touch of the Force was not a beginning of a war, but a discovery of a universal connection. That it ended in division, in millennia of suffering, is the first and greatest tragedy of the galaxy far, far away. A tragedy not of monsters, but of us, of our inability to hold complexity, to manage difference, to sit with discomfort, to truly live in balance. The Force will always be with us, but the peace of Tython, the wisdom of the Jedi, is a memory, a beautiful, melancholic dream of what could have been, its loss a wound in the very fabric of reality that has never healed. And perhaps that memory is the first step toward finding that center once again.